I almost threw the letter away. It looked like every other piece of junk mail that found its way into my mailbox. My name is Evelyn Brooks. I was 70 years old, widowed for nearly 4 years, and living a quiet life in a small Indiana town when that envelope arrived. It was a cool September morning. I had just finished watering the flowers on my front porch and was sorting through the mail at my kitchen table. There were grocery coupons, a utility bill, and a flyer for a local roofing company. The envelope was plain white, slightly thicker than the others, with no return address. Normally, I would have dropped it straight into the recycling bin. Something made me open it instead. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short, so short that I read it twice before I fully understood what it was saying. According to the letter, there was a trust account connected to my late husband that remained active under circumstances I knew nothing about. The letter suggested I contact a legal office immediately regarding records that should concern me. At first, I assumed it had to be a mistake. My husband, Thomas, handled most financial matters during our marriage, but after he passed away, I believed everything had been settled properly. My son Daniel had helped organize paperwork. My daughter-in-law Jessica had attended meetings. We had worked through everything together. At least, that was what I thought. I placed the letter on the table and stared at it for several minutes. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. The ticking clock above the stove sounded louder than usual. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly down the street, and a neighbor walked her dog past my front yard. The world looked exactly the same, yet something inside me felt different. Uneasy. I picked up the letter again and read it a third time. The wording was formal but clear. Whoever sent it believed there was information I did not have. Information connected to my husband. Information important enough to put in writing. My first instinct was to call Daniel. I reached for my phone, then stopped. I could not explain why. Perhaps it was because the letter mentioned records I had never seen. Perhaps it was because a small voice in the back of my mind suggested I learn more before asking questions. Instead, I folded the paper carefully and placed it inside a kitchen drawer. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried reading. I tried gardening. I even attempted to watch one of my favorite television programs. Nothing held my attention. That evening, I opened the drawer and read the letter again. The feeling returned immediately. Not fear. Not exactly. More like the sensation that a door had appeared in a wall I never knew existed. For years, I believed I understood my family. I trusted my son. I trusted my daughter-in-law. I trusted the story I had been told after my husband died. Yet as I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, staring at that single sheet of paper beneath the glow of an overhead light, a troubling thought entered my mind. What if the letter was right? What if there were things about my own life that everyone else already knew? Before that letter arrived, I believed my life was completely understood. Looking back now, that certainty seems almost naive. The years following Thomas's death had been difficult, but they were also predictable. After 43 years of marriage, losing him felt like losing half of my identity. During those first months, Daniel and Jessica were incredibly supportive. They helped organize paperwork, sort through financial records, and handle countless responsibilities I felt too overwhelmed to manage on my own. I was grateful for them. More than grateful. I trusted them completely. Daniel was my only child. I remembered the boy who used to ride his bicycle up and down our driveway until the streetlights came on. I remembered helping him with school projects at the kitchen table and sitting through every baseball game, even when the weather was miserable. Trusting him felt as natural as breathing. Jessica seemed equally dependable. She attended meetings with attorneys, helped schedule appointments, and often checked on me after Thomas passed away. If someone had suggested she might be hiding something from me, I would have laughed. The idea would have seemed ridiculous. My days settled into a quiet routine. I volunteered at the local library twice a week. I attended church on Sundays. I kept a small vegetable garden behind my house. Occasionally, Daniel and Jessica invited me over for dinner. Their home was always lively and welcoming. We talked about work, neighbors, family news, and future plans. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt secretive. Yet after receiving the letter, memories I had never questioned before began resurfacing. Small moments that once seemed unimportant suddenly demanded a second look. I remembered asking Daniel about several financial accounts shortly after Thomas died. His answers had always been quick and reassuring. Everything had been handled, he would say. There was nothing to worry about. At the time, those responses comforted me. Now they sounded different in my memory. Not suspicious exactly, just incomplete. The following afternoon, I opened a file cabinet in my home office and began reviewing old documents. Tax records, insurance paperwork, property information. I was not searching for anything specific. I simply wanted to understand whether the letter could possibly be accurate. Hours passed. Sunlight shifted across the room. By evening, I still had more questions than answers. The next day, I found myself paying closer attention during a phone conversation with Jessica. We discussed ordinary things for several minutes before I casually mentioned that I had been organizing old paperwork. There was a brief pause on the line, so brief that most people would never notice it. Then Jessica laughed lightly and said I should not waste my time worrying about old documents. Everything important had already been resolved years ago. Her response seemed reasonable. Yet after we ended the call, I realized something troubling. She had answered a question I never asked. That night, I sat alone in my living room listening to the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. The letter rested on the coffee table in front of me. For nearly a week, I had been trying to convince myself there was a simple explanation. A clerical mistake, a misunderstanding, an outdated record. But the uneasy feeling remained. Somewhere between the letter, the paperwork, and the reactions I was beginning to notice, a small crack had appeared in the story I thought I knew. And for the first time, I found myself wondering how much of that story actually belonged to me. The following Monday, I decided to call the number listed at the bottom of the letter. I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad beside me and stared at the phone for several minutes before dialing. Part of me hoped nobody would answer. Another part hoped someone finally would. A receptionist transferred me to a man named Michael Grant. The moment he introduced himself, I felt a strange sense of recognition. His name sounded familiar, though I could not immediately remember why. Michael spoke calmly and professionally. He explained that he had worked with my late husband years earlier on several legal and financial matters. Hearing that immediately captured my attention. Thomas had always been careful with paperwork. If Michael knew him, then the letter was not random. It was connected to something real. I asked directly whether the trust account mentioned in the letter actually existed. There was a brief pause before he answered. Then he said yes. The account existed. It had existed for years. My stomach tightened. I asked why I had never heard about it. Another pause followed. This one felt longer. Michael carefully explained that he could not discuss certain details over the phone without verifying documentation first. However, he confirmed that several records connected to the account listed me as a beneficiary. Beneficiary. The word echoed in my mind long after he said it. I thanked him and ended the call, but I remained seated at the table for a long time afterward. The room suddenly felt smaller. Across from me hung a framed photograph of Thomas taken during our 40th wedding anniversary trip. He was smiling at the camera with that familiar expression that always made me feel safe. Looking at that photograph, I found myself asking a question I never imagined asking. What else did I not know? Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. At first, the visit seemed completely ordinary. He brought coffee and asked how I was doing. We talked about the weather and local news. Eventually, I mentioned that I had spent the morning reviewing old financial records. The reaction was immediate. Not dramatic, not obvious, but immediate. Daniel's smile faded slightly. He looked away for a moment before asking why I was interested in those documents all of a sudden. I told him I was simply organizing paperwork. Technically, that was true. Yet his response stayed with me. He encouraged me not to worry about old records and reminded me that everything had already been settled years ago. The conversation sounded almost identical to the one I had recently had with Jessica. After he left, I opened my notebook and wrote down every detail I could remember. The exact words, the timing, the expressions. For the first time, I noticed a pattern. Whenever financial records entered the conversation, both Daniel and Jessica seemed eager to end the discussion quickly. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe not. By evening, I found myself returning to the file cabinet again. This time, I searched more carefully. Old statements, tax documents, insurance papers. Several hours later, buried inside a folder I had not opened in years, I discovered something unexpected. It was a reference to a meeting involving Thomas, Michael Grant, and several documents I had never seen. The date was only months before Thomas passed away. As I stared at that page beneath the lamp on my desk, the uneasy feeling from the letter returned stronger than ever. Whatever my family was trying to protect me from, or perhaps keep from me, It was becoming increasingly clear that the truth had started long before the envelope ever arrived. The next morning, I called Michael Grant again. This time, I asked if we could meet in person. He agreed immediately. 2 days later, I drove to a small legal office located in a quiet business district about 30 miles from my home. The building itself was unremarkable. A brick exterior, a modest parking lot. Nothing about it suggested that answers to some of the biggest questions in my life were waiting inside. Michael greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with legal binders and file boxes. A stack of documents rested neatly on the table between us. Seeing them made my pulse quicken. Michael began by reviewing several records connected to Thomas. Most of the information was familiar. Property documents, insurance paperwork, financial summaries. Then he opened a separate folder. The moment he did, I recognized my husband's signature on the first page. I leaned forward instinctively. Michael explained that several months before Thomas died, he created a trust structure intended to protect certain assets and investments. According to the documents, I was listed as the primary beneficiary. That part did not surprise me. What shocked me was what came next. Michael pointed to a section showing correspondence and updates that should have been provided after Thomas passed away. Several notifications had been issued. Several meetings had been scheduled. Several requests for confirmation had been documented. Yet I had never received any of them. Not one. I sat quietly while Michael turned page after page. Each document raised new questions. Some records showed communications sent to an address connected to Daniel and Jessica. Other documents referenced conversations I knew nothing about. None of it made sense. When I finally asked why these records had never reached me, Michael looked genuinely uncomfortable. He explained that he had assumed the information was being shared appropriately within the family. At the time, there had been no reason to suspect otherwise. Hearing that answer left me with an unsettling feeling. For years, I had believed I was fully informed about my own affairs. Now I was looking at proof that important information had been circulating around me without ever reaching me. After the meeting ended, Michael provided copies of several documents and encouraged me to review them carefully. I drove home in silence. The folder sat on the passenger seat beside me the entire trip. Every red light felt longer than usual. Every mile gave me more time to think. By the time I reached my driveway, one thing was painfully clear. The letter had not been warning me about a misunderstanding. It had been warning me about a pattern. That evening, I spread the documents across my dining room table. Some pages referenced dates I recognized immediately. Others connected to events I barely remembered. Slowly, a timeline began forming in my mind. Certain conversations with Daniel suddenly felt different. Certain comments from Jessica took on new meaning. For years, I had accepted explanations without questioning them because they came from people I trusted. Now that trust was beginning to crack. As the clock moved past midnight, I reached the final document in the folder. Near the bottom of one page was a note referencing a follow-up meeting that supposedly included family representatives after Thomas's death. Family representatives. The phrase bothered me. I stared at it for several minutes before finally setting the paper down. Whoever attended that meeting knew things I had never been told. And for the first time since opening the letter, I realized the truth might be much bigger than a single trust account. For the next several days, I barely left the house. Every spare moment was spent reviewing the documents Michael had given me. The more carefully I read them, the more uncomfortable I became. Certain records referenced meetings I never attended. Other records mentioned correspondence that never reached me. Most troubling of all were repeated references to discussions involving family representatives acting on behalf of the trust. Each time I saw those words, I found myself asking the same question. Who exactly had been representing me? One rainy afternoon, I called Michael again. This time, I asked directly whether he knew who attended those meetings after Thomas passed away. There was a brief silence before he answered. Then he carefully explained that Daniel had participated in several discussions regarding administrative matters. Hearing my son's name did not shock me. Daniel had always helped with practical responsibilities. What unsettled me was learning how involved he had been. According to Michael, Daniel had received updates, reviewed documents, and discussed decisions connected to the trust. Throughout those conversations, everyone assumed I was fully informed. When I explained that I had never seen most of the documents, Michael sounded genuinely surprised. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my kitchen. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the clock above the stove marked each passing minute. For years, I believed Daniel had simply helped me navigate difficult circumstances after Thomas died. Now I was beginning to wonder whether he knew far more than he ever admitted. Later that week, I decided to review old emails stored on an external hard drive. Thomas had always encouraged me to keep backups of important records. At the time, I considered it one of his more obsessive habits. Now it felt like a gift. Hour after hour, I sorted through years of correspondence. Most messages contained nothing remarkable. Family updates, holiday plans, medical appointments. Then I found something interesting. Several months after Thomas's death, an email chain referenced a scheduled meeting involving trust administrators. Attached to the message was a list of participants. My name was not on it. Daniel's name was. Jessica's name was as well. I stared at the screen for several seconds before reading it again. Then again, the evidence was sitting right in front of me. They had attended meetings concerning matters that directly affected me, yet nobody ever mentioned them. That evening, Daniel called. The timing felt almost unsettling. We spoke casually at first. Then he asked what I had been doing lately. I told him I had been organizing old records. Another pause followed. Not long, just long enough to notice. He quickly changed the subject and asked about my garden. By the time we ended the conversation, I felt more certain than ever that something important was being avoided. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. While reviewing additional files, I found a handwritten note from Thomas. It was brief, only a few sentences, yet one line immediately caught my attention. He wrote that he wanted everything handled transparently so there would never be confusion about his intentions. Transparently. The word seemed almost ironic now, as I placed the note beside the growing stack of documents. On my dining room table, a realization settled over me. Whatever had happened after Thomas died, it was no longer a question of missing paperwork. Too many documents pointed in the same direction. Too many conversations ended the same way. Somewhere between the trust, the meetings, and the information that never reached me, there was a truth my family had worked very hard to keep out of my hands. By early October, my dining room table had disappeared beneath stacks of documents. Trust records, emails, legal correspondence, financial statements, meeting notes, and copies of old letters covered nearly every inch of the surface. Looking at them all together created a strange feeling. Individually, each document seemed harmless. Together, they told a story I never expected to discover. One Saturday morning, I began creating a timeline. I wrote dates on index cards and arranged them across the table. Thomas's final meeting with Michael. The establishment of the trust. The notifications sent after his death. The meetings attended by Daniel and Jessica. The records I never received. As the timeline grew, one fact became impossible to ignore. Information had not simply been delayed. It had been consistently filtered before reaching me. That realization stayed with me throughout the weekend. On Monday afternoon, I received another unexpected call from Michael. He explained that while reviewing archived records, he had located additional correspondence connected to the trust. Several documents included instructions regarding annual updates and beneficiary disclosures. According to the records, those updates had been generated repeatedly over the years. Yet I had never seen them. Michael sounded increasingly troubled. The more information surfaced, the more difficult it became to explain what had happened as a simple oversight. After ending the call, I drove to a nearby park and sat on a bench overlooking a small lake. The autumn leaves had begun changing colors. Families walked along the trails while children tossed breadcrumbs to ducks near the shoreline. Normally, I enjoyed places like that. They helped clear my mind. That afternoon, however, my thoughts kept returning to Daniel. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. I wanted to believe my son had made mistakes rather than choices. Yet every new document pushed me further away from that possibility. A few days later, another piece of evidence emerged unexpectedly. While searching through archived email folders, I found a message exchange between Daniel and Jessica from several years earlier. The message itself was brief and contained nothing illegal or dramatic. What caught my attention was a reference to an upcoming trust review meeting. According to the email, they planned to discuss information before deciding what should be shared with me. I read the message several times. Then I printed it. For months, I had been collecting clues. This felt different. This was not a misunderstanding. This was proof that decisions had been made without my knowledge regarding matters directly connected to me. That evening, I called Daniel. The conversation started normally enough. We discussed the weather, family updates, and a recent football game. Then I mentioned the trust. Silence immediately filled the line. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel asked where I was getting my information. The question itself told me more than his answer ever could. He was not surprised the information existed. He was surprised I had found it. I told him I was simply reviewing old records. His voice tightened slightly. He said there were details I did not fully understand and suggested we discuss everything another time. Then he ended the call sooner than usual. Afterward, I sat alone in my kitchen staring at the printed email. Outside, darkness settled across the neighborhood. The house felt quieter than ever. Yet despite everything I had learned, one question remained unanswered. Why? Why would my own family hide information from me for years? The documents revealed what happened. They still did not reveal the reason. And somehow, I sensed the answer to that question would change everything. The answer arrived sooner than I expected. 3 days after my conversation with Daniel, I received another message from Michael. He asked whether I would be available for a brief meeting the following afternoon. His tone sounded different from previous conversations. More serious, more urgent. When I arrived at his office, he already had several folders spread across the conference table. The moment I sat down, he slid one document toward me. It was a summary from a trust review meeting that occurred nearly 2 years after Thomas died. My eyes immediately moved to the list of attendees. Daniel was there. Jessica was there. So were 2 financial advisors. Once again, my name was missing. Michael pointed toward a section of notes near the bottom of the page. According to the summary, certain distributions connected to the trust had been postponed because family representatives believed additional time was needed before discussing the matter with me. I read the sentence 3 times. Family representatives. The same phrase appeared again. This time, however, there was something new. Attached to the notes was a recommendation explaining why information should remain limited. The explanation was brief. It claimed that I would become overwhelmed by complex financial matters and that it would be easier if Daniel handled everything on my behalf. Easier. The word felt almost insulting. For years, I had managed a household, raised a child, worked full-time, and helped build a life alongside Thomas. Yet someone had decided I was incapable of understanding information connected to my own future. Driving home that afternoon, I felt a mixture of sadness and clarity. The mystery surrounding the hidden information was beginning to unravel. What I still did not understand was whether Daniel genuinely believed he was helping me or whether something else had influenced those decisions. That evening, another clue appeared unexpectedly. While organizing the documents Michael had provided, I discovered a reference to an investment account connected to the trust. The account generated annual statements. According to the records, those statements were consistently mailed to an address I recognized immediately. Daniel's address. Not mine. My hands tightened around the page. This was no longer a matter of delayed communication. Important. Information had been redirected for years. The following day, I called Daniel again. This time, I asked direct questions. At first, he sounded uncomfortable, then defensive. He insisted that everything had been done with good intentions. He claimed he was trying to protect me from stress after Thomas passed away. Several times, he repeated that phrase. Protect you. Yet every answer seemed to create new questions. When I asked why trust statements were sent to his address, he hesitated before saying Jessica had helped organize paperwork years earlier and that certain arrangements simply continued from there. The explanation felt incomplete. After we ended the call, I sat quietly at my dining room table. The evidence spread before me looked different now. Until recently, I believed my family was hiding information. Now I understood something more troubling. They had been making decisions on my behalf without my knowledge. Whether those decisions were motivated by convenience, control, or something else entirely remained unclear. But one fact could no longer be ignored. The trust was never hidden from everyone. It had only been hidden from me. And as I stared at the growing collection of documents beneath the warm glow of the dining room light, I realized the next conversation would have to involve more than questions. The time for explanations was approaching. Soon, everyone would need to sit down together and confront the same facts I had spent months uncovering. The meeting took place on a chilly Saturday afternoon in early November. The sky outside was gray, and a steady wind pushed fallen leaves across the sidewalks as I drove to Daniel and Jessica's house. For days, I had debated whether to confront them at all. Part of me wanted to walk away and simply accept what I had learned. But another part knew I would never find peace unless everything was finally brought into the open. Daniel agreed to gather everyone together. Michael attended as well. Several family members who had been involved in various discussions over the years joined us around the dining room table. The atmosphere felt uneasy from the moment I arrived. Conversations were brief. Smiles appeared and disappeared quickly. Everyone seemed aware that something important was about to happen. Jessica remained calm. In fact, she looked remarkably confident. She greeted everyone warmly and moved through the room as though she expected the afternoon to be routine. Daniel appeared more nervous. He rarely sat still. He checked his phone repeatedly and avoided eye contact whenever our gazes met. Once everyone was seated, I placed a large binder on the table. The same binder that had followed me through months of investigation. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel cleared his throat and said he hoped we could resolve misunderstandings without creating unnecessary conflict. The comment immediately caught my attention. Misunderstandings. Even now, he wanted to believe that was all this was. I opened the binder slowly and began with the letter that started everything. I explained how it arrived. I explained the questions it raised. Then I moved through the timeline step by step. Trust documents, meeting records, notifications I never received, correspondence redirected elsewhere, financial statements mailed to Daniel's address, family representatives making decisions without my knowledge. At first, Jessica responded confidently. She insisted that every action had been taken with good intentions. She claimed everyone believed they were helping me during a difficult period after Thomas died. Several times, Daniel nodded in agreement. Then Michael began reviewing specific records. One document contradicted an explanation. Another raised additional questions. A third showed information that should have been shared years earlier. Gradually, the conversation shifted. Jessica continued offering explanations, but each explanation seemed to create new inconsistencies. The room grew quieter. Family members began asking questions of their own. Why was Evelyn never informed? Why were trust updates sent elsewhere? Why were meetings conducted without her participation? For the first time, nobody seemed interested in accepting easy answers. Daniel attempted to defend several decisions. He argued that he had acted out of concern. He said he never intended to cause harm. Listening to him, I believed that part was true. Yet good intentions did not explain everything. Eventually, I placed the final group of documents on the table. These included the emails discussing what information should be shared with me and what information should remain limited. As people read them, the atmosphere changed completely. The issue was no longer whether mistakes had occurred. The issue was how many choices had been made without my knowledge. Daniel picked up one of the emails and stared at it for a long time. Jessica sat silently beside him. Across the table, several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody was arguing anymore. Nobody was defending anything. The facts were doing all the talking. As I looked around the room, I realized everyone had finally reached the same place I had reached months earlier. The story they believed was beginning to fall apart. The silence that settled over the room felt heavier than any argument ever could. One by one, people continued reading the documents spread across the table. Emails, trust records, meeting summaries, financial statements. For months, I had carried the weight of those papers alone. Now everyone else was seeing what I had seen. The difference was visible on their faces. Confusion gave way to realization. Realization gave way to discomfort. Across the table, Daniel remained focused on the email discussing what information should and should not be shared with me. He read it again, then once more. Finally, he set it down and leaned back in his chair. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Michael quietly explained how unusual it was for a primary beneficiary to be excluded from so many communications for so long. His voice remained professional, but the message was clear. Whatever intentions existed at the beginning, the situation had gone far beyond simple assistance. Jessica stared at the table. Gone was the confidence she carried when the meeting started. Several times she opened her mouth as if she wanted to explain something, then stopped. The explanations that once sounded reasonable no longer fit the facts sitting in front of everyone. Eventually, Daniel spoke. His voice sounded different than before, softer, tired. He admitted that after Thomas died, he and Jessica believed they were helping me by handling complicated financial matters themselves. At first, they told themselves it would only be temporary. Then months became years. Important updates became routine. Decisions became habits. Information stopped flowing because everyone assumed someone else had already shared it. Listening to him, I could see genuine regret in his expression. Yet I also understood something important. Good intentions at the beginning do not erase years of choices afterward. Several relatives asked questions. Some wanted clarification. Others simply wanted to understand how the situation had continued for so long. The answers were not dramatic. There was no shocking confession. No secret fortune hidden away. Instead, the truth proved far more ordinary and, in some ways, more painful. A series of decisions had been made for me rather than with me. Opportunities to tell me the truth had come and gone repeatedly. And each time, someone decided it was easier to continue managing things without my involvement. As the afternoon faded into evening, the atmosphere in the room slowly changed. The tension remained, but it was no longer fueled by uncertainty. Everyone now understood what happened. The mystery that began with a single letter had finally been solved. Before people began leaving, Daniel turned toward me. For a moment, he struggled to find words. Then he apologized, not only for the information I never received, but for assuming he knew what was best for me without ever asking what I wanted. Hearing those words did not erase the past. It did not restore the years I spent uninformed. But it mattered, more than I expected. Later that evening, I drove home beneath a sky filled with stars. The binder rested on the passenger seat beside me. The same binder that had grown thicker with every question, every document, and every discovery. When I arrived home, I placed it on the kitchen table and looked at the original letter resting beside it. Such a simple piece of paper. A single envelope that almost ended up in the trash. I smiled softly and turned off the light. The letter had revealed what my family tried to hide, but it had also revealed something else. The truth does not disappear simply because people avoid it. It waits patiently, and sooner or later, it finds its way into the light.